All right, AP Environmental Science, the living world and ecosystems, global currents and biomes. This video will be on air currents. By the end of this section video, you should be able to explain how the properties of air currents affect the way the atmosphere moves, identify some factors that drive atmospheric conditions and convection currents, describe how Earth's rotation is affected by air currents, and then explain how the movement of air currents over mountain ranges also affects climates. So air has several important properties that determine how it circulates the atmosphere. There's actually 4 properties. They are density, water vapor capacity, adiabatic heating or cooling, and latent heat release. When it comes to density, the density of air determines its movement. Less dense air rises, whereas denser air sinks. At a constant atmospheric pressure, warm air actually has a lower density than cold air. Because of this density difference, warm air will rise, whether in a room or it's in your house or even in the atmosphere. All right, the second property that I just discussed determines how air circulates and its capacity to contain water vapor. For example, like warm air is not only less dense than cold air, but it also has a higher capacity for water vapor. And in a lot of those regions of the world that receive like a substantial amount of precipitation, those hot summer days are associated with high humidity because the warm air that the people are in, that the organisms are in, contains a lot of water vapor. The maximum amount of water vapor that it can hold, that air can actually hold, is what we call the saturation point. So in this figure, you can see the relationship between the temperature of air, and its saturation point. When the temperature of air falls, its saturation point decreases, and water vapor condenses into a liquid, like clouds form, and then the precipitation occurs. Alrighty, the third property of air is its response to changing in pressure. As air rises higher in the atmosphere, the pressure decreases. So lower pressure allows the rising air to expand in volume, and this expansion lowers the temperature of that air. The cooling effect of reduced pressure on air as it rises is the atmosphere expands, is what we call adiabatic cooling. In opposite of that, when air sinks towards the Earth's surface, the pressure increases. So the higher pressure forces the air to decrease its volume, and it's this decrease that rises the temperature of the air. So the heating effect of increased pressure on the air as it sinks towards the Earth's surface and decreases in volume is called adiabatic heating. And finally, the last property of air that determines how it circulates, it's a production of heat when water vapor condenses from a gas to a liquid. So as you may know, the sun provides energy necessary to evaporate water on Earth, right? And then convert that into a water vapor, which enters the atmosphere. All right, so in the reverse process, when water vapor in the atmosphere condenses back into a liquid, energy is released as heat. You need to highlight that. Energy is released as heat when the reverse process, when water vapor in the atmosphere condenses. Okay. The release of this energy when water vapor in the atmosphere condenses back into a liquid is known as latent heat release. So it's because of this latent heat release that whenever water vapor in the atmosphere condenses, the air will become warmer and you'll have a rise in the atmosphere. A major contributor to the different climates of the world is what we call atmospheric convection currents. These are global patterns of air that move around the planet, and this is initiated by the unequal heating of Earth. So if you remember the term convection, these air currents are called convection currents because they involve the movement of air that is absorbed and releases heat as the air moves up into the atmosphere and then back to Earth, like in a convection process. Like if you remember, the convection process as it moves. These atmospheric convection currents are found at a very specific place on Earth. For example, Hadley cells are convection currents that cycle between the equator, approximately 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. In a Hadley cell, the unequal warming of the tropics causes the air near the equator to expand and then rise. So this rising air cools and then condenses and then water falls as precipitation over the tropics. It's the circulation of these Hadley cells that is driven by this intense solar energy that strikes the Earth directly near the equator. So the latitude that receives the most intense sunlight, which causes these ascending branches of atmosphere to come off of the two Hadley cells as they converge, are what we call intertropical convergence zone. It's a mouthful. I'll show you the diagram here in a minute. Another set of atmospheric convection currents near the poles are what we call polar cells, and these are convection currents that are formed somewhere between 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south, and sinks into the poles at 90 degrees north and 90 degrees south. So this third type of convection current is known as a ferrule cell. It lies between the Hadley and the polar cells. Air currents in these latitudes do not form like this direct convection cell, but they're driven by a circulation of the neighboring two cells, so they rely on the other two to work. So perhaps it'll be a little clearer here. So the one that we see a lot in test questions and that you hear a lot about are the Hadley cells, and these are these atmospheric convection currents that operate between 30 degrees south and 30 degrees north. All right, so solar energy warms this very, very humid air, and that warm air eventually rises to the point where it cools at its saturation point. At that point, that water vapor it contains condenses into a cloud and then forms as precipitation. The air in which is now contained when it sinks has very little moisture when it sinks to Earth. Earth's surface at approximately 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south is simultaneously being warmed. And so it's this warming there that causes this descent of hot, dry, desert-like conditions, which is what we find around that latitude directly around the equator. All right, I know that's a lot, so thank you for joining me here. Ocean currents is next.